Everyone talks about Family Guy like it simply got worse over time. A joke here, a lazy season there, nothing more. Rival creators, critics, and the show's own fans would tell a very different story. In this video, we break down where the downfall actually started. The first death, 2 cancellations, 1999 to 2002. Family Guy did not start out as untouchable. Long before it became one of the longest-running shows in television history, it was a fragile little cartoon that Fox almost threw away twice. The story of its downfall does not begin with a bad joke or an angry fan reaction. It begins years earlier, with a show that could barely stay on the air long enough to find its footing. Seth MacFarlane created the idea behind Family Guy after making 2 short animated films while he was still a student. Those films were called The Life of Larry and Steve. They followed a lazy, overweight man named Larry and his sarcastic talking dog named Steve.
MacFarlane liked the dynamic between the 2 characters enough to build on it later, reworking Larry and Steve into Peter Griffin and Brian Griffin. He gave Peter a wife, 3 kids, and a fictional town in Rhode Island called Quahog, and pitched the whole concept to Fox as a short animated pilot in 1998. Fox liked what they saw enough to give it a full order, and Family Guy premiered on television in early 1999, right after the Super Bowl, one of the biggest advertising time slots in the entire television calendar. That kind of launch usually signals that a network believes in a show. For a moment, it looked like that belief was justified. The premiere pulled in a massive audience, but a large part of that audience was simply people who had already been watching football and stuck around out of curiosity once the game ended. A strong first night does not guarantee a strong show, and Family Guy learned that lesson almost immediately. Once the season moved out of its lucky post-football slot and into a normal weekly time period, the numbers dropped fast. Fox had scheduled the show on Sunday nights, going up directly against other already popular programs, and general audiences did not follow the Griffins the way the network had hoped they would. By the end of that first season, ratings had fallen low enough that Fox seriously considered pulling the plug entirely, only a matter of months after giving the show its expensive premiere slot. This is the part of the story that gets forgotten by people who only know Family Guy as a long-running hit with hundreds of episodes behind it. The show almost died before most viewers even had the chance to fully understand who these characters were supposed to be. Peter had barely been established as a loving but clueless father. Stewie had barely gotten the chance to plot world domination in more than a handful of episodes. Brian had barely finished making his first sarcastic comment about the family he lived with, and Fox was already weighing whether to cut the whole project loose before it had a real chance to grow into itself. The network gave the show a temporary reprieve instead of a full cancellation. That decision kept Family Guy alive long enough to produce more episodes, but it did not fix the underlying problem. The ratings issue never really disappeared. It just got pushed further down the road. Family Guy limped forward, got shuffled around the schedule again, and eventually came back for a 3rd season in 2001. On paper, reaching a 3rd season sounds like a sign of stability for any show. In practice, this was a program being treated the way a struggling small business gets treated by a landlord, kept open just long enough to see if things might turn around without anyone fully expecting that they would. Season 3 did not turn things around. If anything, it confirmed what Fox executives had already suspected after watching the numbers for 2 years straight. The show was clever, it had built a small but genuinely loyal pocket of fans, but it was not pulling the kind of audience that justified its production costs or its valuable time slot. Animated shows made for adults were still a hard sell to general audiences back in the early 2000s. The Simpsons had already proven that an adult-focused cartoon could succeed on network television, but The Simpsons had spent years earning that trust with viewers by the time Family Guy showed up. Family Guy was still the new arrival, trying to prove it belonged on the same channel, and it was attempting to do that while constantly getting moved around a schedule that never let it settle into one consistent, predictable night that viewers could plan around. There was also outside pressure working against the show that had nothing to do with ratings on their own. In the year 2000, a group called the Parents Television Council specifically pushed Fox to cancel Family Guy, pointing to what they described as strong resistance from advertisers combined with the show's low viewership numbers. Advertisers pay networks for a show to exist in the first place, covering the cost of production through commercial breaks. When an organized group is actively campaigning to scare advertisers away from a specific program, it becomes even harder for that show to survive, no matter how sharp or original the writing behind it might be. Family Guy found itself squeezed from multiple directions at the exact same time. It had a shaky and inconsistent audience, a network that kept shifting its air date without warning, and outside critics actively working behind the scenes to convince sponsors to keep their distance from it entirely. By 2002, once season 3 had finished airing, Fox made the call that many people close to to the show had quietly expected for a while.
Family Guy was canceled. Not paused, not benched for a single season while the network figured out a better time slot, but canceled outright. The same final word used for shows that never come back to television in any form. There was even one finished episode that had not aired yet by the time the cancellation was announced, and it sat unused in storage for almost a year before it finally aired somewhere else entirely, quietly closing out the show's original 3-season run in a strange, low-key way that nobody watching at the time would have guessed was actually the true ending of the story. Think about what that means for a show that is now considered one of the most recognizable animated programs ever made. For 3 full years, Family Guy existed, nearly disappeared, came back on shaky and uncertain ground, and then disappeared again, this time with what looked like real and permanent finality. If the story had stopped there, most people alive today would have no memory of Peter Griffin at all. He would be a footnote, one of dozens of animated characters from short-lived early 2000s shows that networks tried once and quickly dropped without much fanfare. Quahog would be nothing but a forgotten name buried somewhere in old television schedules from over 2 decades ago. Stewie's plans for world domination would have ended abruptly in 2002, unfinished, trapped inside a canceled cartoon that only a small group of devoted fans still remembered fondly. This is the part of the downfall that tends to get skipped over the most, mainly because it happened before the show became famous enough for anyone outside its small fan base to bother tracking its problems closely. People love to talk about later seasons losing their spark, about certain jokes aging badly with time, about characters changing in ways longtime fans did not appreciate. Those are all real and worthwhile conversations to have about the show's later years, but none of that later history matters at all if the show never gets the chance to build a history in the first place. Before Family Guy could ever decline from a creative peak, it first had to survive being canceled from the very bottom, twice, within the span of just 3 years on air. What makes this early stretch of the show especially interesting looking back is how ordinary it all appeared at the time it was happening. This was not some dramatic public flameout filled with headlines and controversy. There was no huge scandal, no major cultural conversation happening anywhere about whether Family Guy deserved a place on television. It was simply a struggling show with weak ratings, being handled the exact same way networks handle any struggling show with weak ratings, shuffled from time slot to time slot, given one more chance after the last one failed, and then quietly dropped once that final chance did not pay off the way anyone had hoped. Fox was not thinking about legacy or long-term cultural value during this period. Fox was thinking about time slots, advertising revenue, and production budgets, the same practical business concerns that shape decisions about any struggling television program, regardless of how clever its writing might actually be. Seth MacFarlane has spoken openly in later interviews about that early period as a genuinely difficult stretch for the show and everyone working on it, one where the entire staff was constantly fighting just to stay visible on an already crowded network schedule. The version of Family Guy that existed across those first 3 seasons was noticeably rougher around the edges, compared to what audiences would eventually see once the show returned years later. The animation style was still developing, the pacing between jokes was still being worked out, and the way characters bounced off one another had not yet settled into the rhythm most fans would come to recognize. Some of the show's most well-known trademarks, like its heavy reliance on cutaway jokes that jump away from the main story for a short, unrelated gag before returning to the plot, were already present in these early seasons, but they had not yet become the defining feature that people across the internet would later associate with the entire brand. In many ways, the version of the show that got canceled in 2002 was still an early draft of what Family Guy would eventually grow into. None of that context mattered much to Fox at the time the decision was made. A show either pulls in the necessary numbers or it does not, and by every measurement the network cared about, Family Guy simply was not pulling them. The cancellation that came in 2002 looked, from every practical business angle available, like the true final chapter of the Griffin family's story. Peter Griffin's journey appeared to be finished for good. The entire show seemed headed for the same fate as countless other short-lived animated programs that quietly vanish after only a few seasons, and end up remembered only by a small circle of devoted viewers lucky enough to have caught them the first time they aired. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But something unusual was already happening quietly in the background, something that had nothing to do with Fox's official decision. A cable network built around adult cartoons was about to give Family Guy an unexpected second life. At the same time, stores across the country were selling copies of the canceled show in numbers nobody in the industry had predicted. Section 2, Saved by Reruns and DVDs, The Unlikely Resurrection, 2003 to 2005. By 2002, Family Guy was finished, as far as Fox was concerned. The show had been canceled twice in 3 years, and the second cancellation looked permanent. There was no announcement of a comeback, no plan for a fourth season, and no reason for anyone inside the network to believe the Griffin family would ever appear on television again. Peter, Lois, Chris, Meg, Stewie, and Brian were headed for the same fate as countless other canceled shows, quietly forgotten by everyone except a small group of fans who had caught the original episodes when they aired. What nobody at Fox understood in 2002 was that the show's real audience had never actually watched it live on Sunday nights in the first place. A huge part of the people who would eventually fall in love with Family Guy had not even discovered the show yet. They were about to find it somewhere else entirely, on a channel most network executives were not paying close attention to, and through a format that had nothing to do with weekly ratings. That channel was Cartoon Network's late-night programming block, known as Adult Swim. This block had been built specifically to show cartoons aimed at older teenagers and adults, running after most children had gone to bed. It was still a fairly new idea at the time. Regular Cartoon Network programming during the day was aimed at kids, but once night fell, the channel handed the schedule over to shows with more mature humor, stranger pacing, and content that would never have worked in an afternoon time slot. Adult Swim needed programming to fill that late-night block, and canceled shows with strong cult followings were exactly the kind of content that fit. In 2003, not long after Fox pulled the plug on Family Guy for the second time, the rights to air reruns of the show were picked up for use on this late-night block. According to comments later made by an executive at 20th Century Fox Television Production, the deal to hand over the reruns happened for almost no money at all. Fox did not see much value in a canceled show with a small audience, so the price to license those old episodes for reruns ended up being extremely low. Nobody at Fox seemed to expect much to come from it. From their perspective, the show had already failed on their own network, so there was little reason to think it would suddenly succeed somewhere else. That assumption turned out to be completely wrong. Once Family Guy started airing in reruns on Adult Swim, something happened that surprised almost everyone involved. The show quickly became the highest-rated program on the entire Adult Swim block. It was not just doing well among other late-night cartoons, it was outperforming nearly everything else the block had to offer, pulling in numbers that were unusually strong for a rerun of a canceled show. Reports at the time noted that Family Guy episodes were drawing close to 2 million viewers on average during their Adult Swim airings, a number that stood out sharply against the kind of audience the show had been pulling during its final, struggling months on Fox. Even more telling than the raw viewership number was the effect the show had on the entire block around it. Once Family Guy joined the Adult Swim lineup, the overall viewership for the block reportedly jumped by more than 200%. That kind of increase does not happen by accident, and it does not happen because a channel simply added one more decent show to its schedule. It happens when a specific program becomes the reason people are tuning in at all, dragging along a much larger audience than the channel had been pulling before. This created a strange and almost backward situation. A show that Fox had judged to be a ratings failure on network television was now acting as the single biggest draw on an entirely different channel, watched by people staying up late specifically to see it. The humor that had struggled to find a wide audience during a competitive Sunday night slot against other established programs was suddenly thriving in a setting built around a smaller, more dedicated, more online audience, willing to search out something different. Family Guy was not a bad show that had been correctly canceled. It was a show that had been placed in the wrong environment the first time around, and Adult Swim gave it the right one almost by accident. While the reruns were quietly building an audience through Adult Swim, something else was happening at the same time that turned out to matter just as much, if not more. Fox had already released the first season of Family Guy on DVD back in April 2003, shortly after the cancellation had already taken effect. Releasing a DVD set for a canceled show is not usually treated as a major event by a studio. It is often seen as a simple way to make a little extra money off old episodes that already exist without any expectation that the release itself will change the show's fate. Nobody involved in putting that DVD set together seemed to be expecting a hit. Instead, the DVD became one of the biggest selling television releases of that entire year. Sales for the Season 1 and Season 2 DVD sets reached numbers that shocked people across the entertainment industry, with reports citing sales between 2.2 million and 3 million copies. That made it the best-selling television DVD of 2003, and at the time, it was recorded as the second highest-selling television DVD ever released, trailing only behind the DVD release of the first season of Chappelle's Show on Comedy Central. For context, this was a canceled show, already pulled from the air, competing against DVD sets for shows that were still airing new episodes and actively promoted on television. Family Guy was outselling almost everything else in its category, despite having no new content and no network support behind it. The timing of the DVD release and the Adult Swim reruns lined up almost perfectly, and the two things fed into each other in a way that created something much bigger than either one could have created alone. People who caught the reruns late at night on Adult Swim went looking for more episodes and found the DVD sets in stores. People who bought the DVD sets because they had heard about the show from friends ended up staying up late to catch the reruns as well, just to see if new episodes might eventually show up. Word of mouth about the show spread in a way that had nothing to do with traditional television advertising or network promotion. It spread the way word of mouth about a good movie or a good album spreads, through people directly telling other people that this was something worth watching. This is worth pausing on, because it represents something that had not really happened before in quite the same way. Television shows in this era lived or died almost entirely based on their live ratings while airing new episodes on a network. Once a show got canceled, that was typically treated as the end of the conversation. A canceled show might get a small fan following through reruns eventually, but it was extremely rare for that kind of afterlife to become large enough or visible enough that it could actually change a network's mind about bringing the show back. Fox had never seen anything like the numbers Family Guy was producing after its own cancellation, because very few shows before it had ever produced numbers like that after being canceled. By 2004, the evidence had become impossible for Fox to ignore. The reruns on Adult Swim were still performing at the top of their block. The DVD sales kept climbing, eventually surpassing 3 million copies according to some reports at the time. A show that Fox had officially declared dead less than 2 years earlier was clearly still alive in the minds of a large and growing audience. An audience that had somehow gotten bigger after the show stopped producing new episodes, rather than smaller. That is an unusual pattern for any piece of entertainment, and it caught the attention of executives who had originally been the ones to cancel the show in the first place. On May 20th, 2004, Fox made the decision that nobody involved in the original 2002 cancellation would have predicted. The network ordered 35 new episodes of Family Guy, officially bringing the show back from the dead. This decision marked the first time in television history that a canceled show had been revived specifically because of strong DVD sales and rerun performance, rather than any pressure coming from the original broadcast network's own ratings. Other shows before it had occasionally gotten extended runs or spin-offs based on continued popularity, but Family Guy became known as something different. A show that had been fully and officially canceled, then brought back to life almost entirely because of what viewers did with it after the network had already given up. The gap between the last new episode of the original run and the return of new episodes ended up being roughly 3 years, an unusually long break for any television series, let alone an animated one. Animated shows in particular almost never take long breaks in the middle of their run, since production schedules and voice cast availability are usually built around a steady yearly output. Seth MacFarlane later spoke about that gap in interviews, saying he actually believed the long hiatus worked out in the show's favor. His reasoning was that animated series typically do not get natural breaks the way live-action shows sometimes do, and that a forced pause like this one gave everyone involved a chance to step back, recharge creatively, and return to the material with fresh energy, rather than producing episode after episode without any real gap for reflection. Family Guy's 4th season premiered on May 1st, 2005, nearly 3 full years after the original series had ended its run following the second cancellation. The episode that marked this return was called North by North Quahog, written by Seth MacFarlane himself and directed by Peter Shin. Choosing to have MacFarlane personally write the episode that brought the show back signaled how much weight Fox and the creative team placed on getting this moment right. This was not a random episode handed off to a staff writer. It was treated as a genuine event, a chance to prove that the show deserved the unusual second chance it had just been given. The numbers for that premiere backed up everything the network had been betting on. North by North Quahog drew in close to 11.85 million viewers, according to reporting at the time, a massive audience for any show, let alone one returning from a lengthy cancellation. To put that number into perspective, it was significantly higher than the ratings Family Guy had ever pulled during its original 3-season run on Fox. The very same show that had been judged too weak to keep on the air in 2002 was now pulling in an audience that dwarfed anything it had managed the first time around, just 3 years later, using the exact same characters and the exact same basic premise. Fox also made a smarter scheduling decision this time, learning from the mistakes
mistakes of the original run. Rather than placing the show in a difficult, competitive Sunday time slot against other established programs, the way it had done previously, the network scheduled the returning show right after The Simpsons, a program that had already spent well over a decade proving that adult animated comedy could hold a large, loyal Sunday night audience.
This gave Family Guy a much safer landing spot, allowing it to inherit a chunk of an audience that was already tuned in and already comfortable with the style of humor found in animated sitcoms aimed at grown viewers rather than children. The results of this new approach were immediate and lasting. Family Guy did not simply survive its return. It became one of the more consistent performers on Fox's entire schedule going forward. The show that had once needed a rerun deal and a surprise DVD hit just to prove it deserved to exist was now airing new episodes on a regular basis, building on the audience it had rebuilt during its time away from the network. Within a few years of returning, the show had grown into enough of a critical and cultural presence that in 2009, it received a nomination for a Primetime Emmy Award in the category of Outstanding Comedy Series.
That kind of nomination was rare territory for any animated show at the time, since the Emmy category for comedy series was historically dominated almost entirely by live-action sitcoms. Being recognized in that category placed Family Guy in a small group of animated programs that had managed to be taken seriously by an awards body built mostly around traditional television formats. Looking back at this stretch of the show's history, the entire sequence of events reads almost like a lucky accident stacked on top of another lucky accident. A canceled show happened to land on the right late-night cable block at the right time, just as that block was looking for exactly the kind of edgy, cutaway-heavy humor Family Guy specialized in. A DVD release that nobody expected much from happened to catch on with buyers at the exact moment DVD collections were becoming a popular way for people to revisit or discover television shows outside of their original broadcast schedule. Two separate forms of media, cable reruns and physical home video sales, ended up reinforcing each other at the same time, creating a wave of attention that Fox eventually could not ignore, no matter how firmly it had closed the door on the show back in 2002. There is also something worth noting about how different this comeback was from a typical television revival. Most shows that get brought back after cancellation return because a network changes its mind quickly, sometimes within the same year, often due to vocal fan campaigns, mail-in letter drives, or direct pressure applied while the show's absence is still fresh in the public's mind. Family Guy's revival did not happen because of a loud, organized fan campaign demanding its return. It happened quietly, almost passively, through ordinary people simply choosing to buy DVDs and choosing to stay up late to watch reruns on a channel that had nothing to do with the show's original network.
The audience was not shouting for the show to come back. The audience was simply proving through their own viewing habits and their own spending that the show still had commercial value, even after it had been given up on completely. This distinction matters when thinking about the larger story of Family Guy's rise and eventual decline. The show did not return to television because a passionate fan base staged a rescue effort in the traditional sense. It returned because Fox looked at cold, simple numbers, rerun ratings on another network's late-night block, and DVD sales figures sitting on a spreadsheet, and concluded that there was still real money to be made bringing the Griffins back. That is an important detail, because it sets up a pattern that would repeat itself throughout the show's history in different forms. Decisions about the show's future were, time and time again, driven primarily by numbers and business logic, rather than pure creative ambition, and that pattern would eventually shape both the strengths and the weaknesses of the seasons that followed. It is also worth remembering just how unusual this entire chain of events looked within the television industry at the time it happened. Networks did not typically watch rerun performance on a completely different channel and treat it as a signal to revive a canceled show. Studios did not typically expect a DVD release for an already canceled program to outsell DVD sets for shows that were still actively airing new episodes. Family Guy's path back onto television broke enough of the usual patterns that it became something other struggling shows and their fans would later point to as a hopeful example, proof that a canceled show was not always permanently finished if enough people kept watching it in whatever form they could find. None of this means the comeback solved every problem the show would eventually face. Getting a second chance is not the same thing as guaranteeing that a show will use that second chance wisely for the next 2 decades. Fox had brought Family Guy back because the numbers made sense, not necessarily because every person involved in the decision believed the show's best creative days were still ahead of it. The show now had a real opportunity in front of it, a wide audience, a safer time slot, and a chance to build something lasting after having already proven it could survive being canceled not once, but twice. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What happened next, across
the seasons that followed this unlikely resurrection would end up defining exactly how people remember Family Guy today.
The show entered a period widely remembered by longtime viewers and critics as its strongest creative stretch, a run of seasons where the writing, the character work, and the humor came together in a way that many people still consider the high point of the entire series. But even during that celebrated stretch, small signs were already beginning to appear, quiet details that longtime fans and critics would later look back on and point to as the very first hints that something in the writing was starting to shift, long before most casual viewers had any reason to notice. Section 3. The Golden Era and the First Signs of Cracks, Seasons 4 to 7. When Family Guy came back to television on May 1st, 2005, it did not creep back quietly. Season 4 ran for 30 episodes, making it the longest season the show had produced up to that point, longer than any of the 3 seasons that came before the cancellation. Fox was not testing the waters with a short trial run. The network gave the returning show a full, heavy season, treating it like a proven hit rather than a risky experiment. Critics who reviewed the new episodes largely responded well, describing the humor as sharp and just as strong as it had ever been, with several reviewers noting that the show had lost none of its edge during the 3 years it had been off the air. This is the point where most longtime fans agree the show entered its strongest creative stretch. The label of a golden era gets used loosely for a lot of shows, but in the case of Family Guy, the years following the 2005 comeback line up almost exactly with the seasons that produced the material people still bring up today. Stewie's plots against his mother, Brian's constant attempts to be taken seriously as a writer, Peter's endless string of terrible decisions, and Quagmire's over-the-top personality all reached a kind of peak during this stretch, supported by writing that balanced sharp jokes with actual character consistency from episode to episode. Part of what made this period stand out was timing that had nothing to do with the show itself. Season 4 aired right as video sharing websites were becoming a normal part of everyday life for millions of people. Short clips that used to only exist inside a full episode could now be pulled out, shared, and watched again and again by people who had never even seen the full episode they came from. Family Guy's format was almost perfectly built for this kind of sharing. The show already relied heavily on short cutaway jokes, quick scenes that jumped away from the main story for a self-contained gag before returning to the plot. These cutaways worked well as short clips because they usually did not need much context from the rest of the episode to be funny on their own. Several of these cutaway jokes became especially well known during this stretch of the show's run, circulating widely online in ways that helped introduce the show to viewers who had never watched it live on Fox. A joke built around a phone message from actor Alan Rickman, a bit where Peter narrates his own life out loud in the style of an old detective story, a scene involving Cookie Monster from Sesame Street shown attending a support group, and a segment showing Will Smith performing an exaggerated, overly polished version of rap music, all became some of the most repeated and passed around clips from this era of the show. None of these needed the full episode around them to land as jokes, which is exactly why they spread so easily once people started sharing video clips online rather than only watching full broadcasts. This period also produced some of the episodes that are still brought up regularly when people discuss the best of Family Guy. Season 5, which ran for 18 episodes between September 2006 and May 2007, included episodes like Barely Legal, Airport 07, and No Chris Left Behind, episodes frequently cited by fans and critics as some of the strongest the show ever produced. Airport 07 in particular built its plot around Quagmire getting fired from his job as a pilot after Peter causes a plane crash by draining the fuel tank, a storyline that leaned into the show's willingness to let its side characters carry entire episodes rather than always centering everything on Peter or Stewie. At the same time, cracks in the reception were already showing up even during this celebrated stretch, and they showed up earlier than most casual viewers would expect. Season 5 received a mixed response from critics, and one of the specific complaints raised at the time was a lack of original writing, with some reviewers feeling the show was starting to lean on ideas and joke structures it had already used before. This criticism did not stop Season 5 from containing several classic episodes, but it shows that even during what fans now remember as one continuous golden stretch, there were already people paying close attention who noticed the writing beginning to repeat familiar patterns, rather than constantly finding new ground. Season 6 brought a different kind of disruption, one that had nothing to do with the writers running out of ideas and everything to do with events happening far outside the show itself. The 2007 to 2008 Writers Guild of America strike, a major labor dispute between television and film writers and the studios that employed them, directly affected the production of Season 6. Seth MacFarlane sided with the striking writers and joined the strike himself, which meant he was not available to do his usual final work on the episodes that were still airing while the strike was ongoing.
As a direct result, Fox ended up airing 3 episodes of the show without MacFarlane's usual creative input before the strike finally ended in February 2008. This detail matters more than it might seem at first glance. MacFarlane was not just the voice of Peter, Stewie, Brian, and several other characters. He also served as one of the key creative forces shaping the tone and final polish of individual episodes. Having him step away during an active labor dispute, even for a short stretch, meant that a handful of episodes went out into the world without the same level of oversight that had shaped the show's most celebrated seasons.
Season 6 ended up shortened because of the strike as well, running only 12 episodes compared to Season 5's 18 and Season 4's massive 30-episode run. A show that had been building serious creative momentum suddenly found its production rhythm interrupted by a dispute that had nothing to do with Family Guy specifically, but affected almost the entire American television and film industry at the time. Even with that disruption, Season 6 still managed to produce material that fans continue to point to as strong. The 2-part storyline Stewie Kills Lois and Lois Kills Stewie, which aired in November 2007, remains one of the most talked about arcs in the show's history, built around Stewie actually following through on his constant threats against his mother, only for the story to twist in unexpected directions. This storyline proved that the writing staff could still take genuine risks with the show's core family dynamic, even while working through a shortened, strike-affected season. The season also produced Peter's Daughter, an episode dealing with a flood in Quahog that leads to Meg ending up in the hospital, an episode frequently mentioned by fans as one of the more emotionally grounded entries from this era, showing a version of the family willing to slow down and deal with real consequences rather than only chasing the next joke. Season 7 followed directly after the strike ended, running 16 episodes from September 2008 to May 2009. This season is where some fans and critics began pointing to a noticeable shift in the show's comedic style, moving further into exaggerated, over-the-top territory, rather than the sharper, more grounded humor that had defined the earlier post-revival seasons. Episodes like Family Gay, which aired in March 2009 and dealt with Peter believing he had somehow become gay after receiving blood from a donor, reflected a growing willingness on the writing staff's part to build entire episodes around a single absurd premise stretched out for a full 22 minutes, rather than balancing that kind of exaggerated concept with the sharper character work that had defined earlier standout episodes. None of this means Season 7 was a weak season on its own terms. It still performed well with audiences and kept the show firmly established as one of Fox's most reliable programs. But looking back at this stretch with the benefit of hindsight, several longtime viewers and critics have identified Seasons 6 and 7 specifically as the point where the show's writing began shifting in small, gradual ways, moving slightly away from the sharper, more character-driven humor of Season 4 and early Season 5 toward broader, more exaggerated premises built around a single big joke idea rather than a tightly written story. One widely shared retrospective covering the show's full run described this stretch as a modest decline compared to what came before it, noting that while the show had not lost its energy entirely, it had started to lose some of the dark, witty edge that defined its strongest early comeback episodes. It is worth being precise about what this shift actually looked like, because it was subtle rather than dramatic. Nobody watching Season 6 or 7 live in real time was declaring the show ruined or unwatchable. Ratings stayed strong throughout this entire stretch, and the show kept its position as one of the more talked about programs on Fox's lineup. The change was smaller and slower than that, showing up more in the type of jokes being used and the pacing of individual episodes, rather than any single dramatic misstep. A show that had built its comeback on tightly constructed episodes with strong character logic was slowly beginning to lean more heavily on big, standalone premises and louder, more exaggerated jokes, a shift that would continue to grow more noticeable in the seasons that followed. This period also lines up with a separate and very public conflict that was unfolding at the exact same time, one that had nothing to do with ratings or network scheduling and everything to do with how other creators in the same industry viewed the show's writing style. Rival animated series had already begun openly criticizing Family Guy's reliance on quick, disconnected jokes rather than jokes built directly out of the story being told, criticism that would eventually turn into one of the most talked about feuds in modern television history. That conflict was already brewing in the background during this exact stretch of episodes, and it would soon become impossible for anyone following the show closely to ignore. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The seasons covered in this stretch, 4 through 7, represent the version of Family Guy that most fans hold up as the show at its very best, packed with cutaway jokes that spread across the internet, storylines that took real risks with its core characters, and a run of episodes
episodes still referenced constantly today. But sitting quietly underneath all of that success were the first small signs of a shift in the writing, a strike that interrupted production at a critical moment, and a growing public conflict with another major animated show that was about to become impossible to ignore. Section 4, The Peter-Rasment Turning Point, Season 8. Season 8 of Family Guy began strong. The premiere episode, Road to the Multiverse, aired on September 27th, 2009, and sent Brian and Stewie jumping between different alternate versions of Quahog, each one built around a different joke about what the world might look like if history had gone another way. That episode is still widely praised today, often mentioned alongside the show's very best work. It proved that even years into its run, Family Guy could still build a genuinely clever episode around a big, ambitious idea, rather than a string of random gags stitched together. But Season 8 also contains a smaller, quieter turning point that longtime fans and critics keep coming back to when they talk about the exact moment the show's tone started to shift into something colder and more mean-spirited. That episode is called Peter-Rasment, and it aired on March 21st, 2010, as the 14th episode of the season. It was written by Chris Sheridan and directed by Julius Wu, two people who had already worked on the show for years by this point, which makes the episode even more useful as a marker, since it was not the product of some brand new, unfamiliar creative team experimenting with the format for the first time. The title itself follows a pattern the show had used before, blending Peter's name with another word to create a new phrase. Earlier seasons had already used this exact trick with episodes titled Petarded, Peterotica, and Petergeist, all from Season 4. Peter-Rasment continues that pattern by combining Peter with the word harassment, and the plot of the episode lives up to that title directly rather than using it as a loose or ironic label. The story follows Peter after he takes a job as a paparazzo, someone who follows celebrities around taking unwanted photographs of them for money. In typical Family Guy fashion, this job quickly spirals into Peter becoming a nuisance to regular citizens around Quahog, as well as local celebrities, chasing people down and snapping photos without any real boundaries. During one of these chases, Peter breaks his glasses. Without them, his appearance changes just enough that his boss at the Pawtucket Brewery, a character named Angela, suddenly finds him attractive in a way she never had before. From this point, the episode turns into an extended storyline built around Angela pursuing Peter for a sexual relationship that he does not want. Peter spends the episode trying to avoid her advances, uncomfortable with the position he has been put in by someone who holds power over his job. Angela does not take the rejection well. She fires him, and the episode escalates the situation even further when she attempts suicide after Peter continues turning her down. This leaves Peter dealing with the aftermath of a situation that started as an office-based conflict and turned into something far heavier by the end of the episode. What makes this episode worth singling out is not simply that it deals with dark subject matter. Family Guy had built its entire identity around going to uncomfortable, sometimes shocking places for the sake of a joke, and it had been doing that since its earliest seasons. The issue critics and fans point to with Peter-Rasment is different. It is about how the show chose to use a serious, real-world issue, workplace harassment, and the abuse of power that can come from an employer pursuing an employee, and folded it into a plot that ultimately treated Peter, a man being sexually harassed by his boss, as the butt of the joke, rather than giving the situation any real weight. The show reversed the typical roles usually associated with workplace harassment storylines, but critics who bring up this episode argue it did so in a way that felt like it was mining the setup for shock value, rather than saying anything meaningful about the subject either way. This episode did not arrive completely out of nowhere. Season 8 as a whole was already earning a reputation among critics for uneven, sometimes uncomfortable storytelling choices, even while it also produced some of the show's more respected episodes. The season included Brian and Stewie, an episode that received largely positive reviews for its writing and for developing the relationship between the two characters through unusually serious, grounded dialogue. At the same time, that same episode became one of the most heavily criticized entries in the show's history because of a specific sequence in which Brian eats material from Stewie's diaper and then vomits, only to eat it again. The Parents Television Council specifically targeted this sequence, and it became one of the most frequently cited examples whenever critics discussed the show pushing gross-out content further than it needed to for the sake of a joke. Looking at Peter-Rasment and Brian and Stewie side by side, both airing within the same season, paints a clearer picture of what Season 8 actually represented in the show's larger story. This was not a season where every episode failed. Road to the Multiverse proved the writing staff could still produce ambitious, well-loved material. Brian and Stewie proved the show could still handle emotional character work when it wanted to. But both of those strong episodes sat right next to material that leaned hard into shock for its own sake, whether through an extended bodily fluid gag or through a plot that used a real-world issue like workplace harassment as a setup for an increasingly uncomfortable joke, rather than a story with any real point behind it. Fans and critics who look back at Season 8 as a turning point are not usually arguing that Family Guy suddenly became a bad show overnight. The argument is more specific than that. It is about a shift in what kind of jokes the writing staff was willing to build entire episodes around, and how much weight they were willing to give to the darker material they chose to include.
Earlier seasons had already touched dark subjects plenty of times, but critics who track this shift argue that around this point in the show's run, the writing started treating discomfort itself as the punchline more often, rather than using dark material as a setup for a sharper, smarter joke underneath it. This shift also lines up with a broader pattern that had already been building since the strike affected Season 6 and the noticeably more exaggerated Season 7. Season 8 continued a trend where individual episodes were increasingly built around one big, often uncomfortable premise stretched out for a full episode, rather than a tightly written story that used its jokes to build character or advance a plot with real stakes. Peter Asment fits neatly into this pattern.
The entire episode exists because of one central, uncomfortable idea: a man being sexually harassed by his boss. And the show spends its full runtime mining that idea for as much material as it can, without doing much to develop the situation beyond the initial shock of the premise itself. It is worth being clear about what this episode did not do, since it is easy to overstate a controversy after the fact. Peter Asment did not generate the kind of massive, organized public backlash that later moments in the show's history would produce. There was no large-scale protest movement built around this specific episode, no viral petition demanding changes, no widespread mainstream news coverage treating it as a major scandal, in the way some other Family Guy controversies would eventually receive.
Its reputation as a turning point comes almost entirely from retrospective analysis, from critics, fans, and reviewers looking back at the show's full run years later and identifying this specific episode as a clear example of where the tone had started to shift. That kind of quiet, retrospective reputation is actually more telling in some ways than a loud, immediate backlash would have been. A scandal that explodes in the moment tends to fade from a show's history once the initial anger dies down. A pattern that critics only notice by looking backward, picking out a specific episode years later as the moment something changed, suggests a slower, more gradual shift that most people did not clearly notice while it was actually happening. Season 8 aired to a large, established audience that had already stuck with the show through its comeback years, and that audience mostly kept watching without any major sign of mass frustration.
The concerns about the show's direction were building underneath the surface, showing up mostly in critical reviews and fan discussions, rather than in any dramatic drop in viewership or any organized public campaign against the show. This matters for understanding how the show's reputation changed over time. A single bad episode rarely sinks a long-running series on its own. What tends to matter more is a pattern that builds slowly across many episodes and many seasons, one uncomfortable choice stacking on top of another until critics and longtime fans start connecting the dots and describing a clear shift rather than just a handful of unrelated missteps. Peter Asment works as a marker for that shift specifically because it is not an extreme outlier compared to everything else happening in Season 8.
It fits directly into a pattern that was already forming, one that had started with the more exaggerated humor of Season 7 and would continue developing across the seasons that followed. There is also something worth noting about how this episode reflects a specific writing habit that would keep showing up in later seasons. Taking a real, serious issue and using it purely as a setup for an increasingly uncomfortable joke, rather than saying anything meaningful about the issue itself, became something critics would point to again and again in discussions about the show's later years. Peter Asment is an early, clear example of this specific pattern, using workplace harassment not as the subject of a pointed piece of satire, but as the mechanism for an escalating series of uncomfortable gags that culminate in a suicide attempt, used mainly to raise the stakes of the joke rather than to say something real about the seriousness of that kind of crisis. None of this erases the fact that Family Guy remained a massively popular and widely watched show throughout this entire period. Season 8 kept its strong position in the ratings, and the show continued to be renewed season after season without any real threat to its future on the network. The turning point represented by
repeaterissement was not a turning point in the show's popularity or its commercial success. It was a turning point in how critics, longtime fans, and eventually casual viewers would come to describe the show's writing style, marking the start of a gradual shift away from the sharper, more character-focused humor of the earlier comeback seasons and toward a style increasingly built around shock value, stretched out across a full episode. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. While this shift was quietly building inside the show's own writing room, a separate and much louder conflict had already been brewing for years, one being waged publicly by a rival animated series that had spent years accusing Family Guy of exactly this kind of lazy, shock-driven writing. Section 5, The South Park War, Cartoon Wars, 2006. By 2006, Family Guy had already survived 2 cancellations, clawed its way back through reruns and DVD sales, and settled into what most fans consider its strongest creative run. The show was popular, profitable, and firmly established as one of the biggest adult animated comedies on network television. But that same year, a separate animated show on a completely different network aimed one of the most direct and public attacks in television history straight at Family Guy, and the criticism behind that attack lines up almost perfectly with the same complaints that critics inside the industry had already started raising about the show's writing. That show was South Park, created by Trey Parker and Matt Stone, airing on Comedy Central since 1997, 2 years before Family Guy even premiered. South Park built its reputation on satire, using its characters and storylines to comment directly on real-world politics, media, and culture, often through sharp, pointed jokes that were built specifically around the story being told in that episode. Family Guy, by contrast, had built much of its identity around cutaway gags, quick jokes that jump away from the main plot for a short, self-contained bit before returning to the story, often with little or no connection to whatever the episode was actually about. Both shows used crude humor, both shows built their audiences around adult viewers, and both shows were frequently mentioned in the same breath by critics and casual viewers trying to describe the modern landscape of adult animated comedy. That constant comparison, more than anything else, appears to be at the root of why Parker and Stone grew increasingly frustrated with being linked to a show they saw as fundamentally different from their own. That frustration became public in April 2006 when South Park aired a 2-part episode called Cartoon Wars, split into Part 1 and Part 2. The storyline centered on a plot involving a planned depiction of the Muslim prophet Muhammad on Family Guy, a plot that closely mirrored a real controversy Parker and Stone had faced with their own network. Comedy Central had restricted South Park from showing a similar depiction of Muhammad in an earlier episode, and Cartoon Wars used that real background as the backdrop for a story about American reaction to a similar image airing on Family Guy instead. The episode followed the fictional panic and public response tied to this planned depiction, using the setup as a way to explore questions about free expression and about who gets held responsible when controversial content reaches the air. While the surface plot dealt with that larger cultural question, the real target of the episode became clear as it went on. In Cartoon Wars Part 2, the character Cartman goes undercover, posing as a sick child, in order to infiltrate the actual production studio behind Family Guy and shut the show down before the controversial episode can air. It is during this storyline that the episode delivers its most direct and most talked about joke about Family Guy's writing process. Cartman discovers that Family Guy is written by a team of manatees, sea animals kept in tanks, who create the show's jokes by randomly selecting beach balls out of a large pile, each ball printed with a single word or phrase. According to the episode, one ball supplies the setup for a joke, and a second ball supplies the punchline, and the two get pulled together at random to generate whatever gag ends up airing. Whales and dolphins are shown running the operation as producers, while the manatees handle the actual writing. This joke was built entirely around a specific criticism of Family Guy's format, the same cutaway gags that had helped make the show famous and had helped it spread across the internet during its comeback years. Parker and Stone were making an argument through the episode itself, suggesting that these jokes were not built out of character or story the way South Park's humor was, but were instead random, interchangeable bits that could be swapped in or out without changing anything meaningful about the episode around them. Cartman, acting as a stand-in for Parker and Stone's own point of view within the story, directly criticizes this style of humor while undercover inside the fictional Family Guy studio, arguing that his own jokes, unlike what he sees happening around him, are built around real situational and emotional stakes tied to an actual plot, rather than random, disconnected gags stacked one after another. It is worth being clear about how specific and pointed this criticism actually actually was, since it goes well beyond a simple joke about a rival show. Parker and Stone were not just poking fun at Family Guy for being crude or juvenile, criticisms that could apply just as easily to their own show. They were making a direct claim about a difference in writing philosophy, arguing that Family Guy's jokes existed independently of any story or character development, while South Park's jokes, in their view, were meant to serve the larger point being made in each episode.
This distinction mattered enough to Parker and Stone that they built an entire two-part storyline around illustrating it, rather than simply mentioning it once in an interview or a passing joke. Family Guy's initial reaction to Cartoon Wars was noticeably restrained compared to the intensity of the original attack. Rather than firing back with an immediate on-screen response, the show's staff largely absorbed the joke and, over time, began referring to their own cutaway-style jokes as manatee jokes during DVD commentary tracks released alongside later home video sets. This response framed the criticism as something the show's own writers could laugh along with, rather than something that needed an aggressive counterattack, at least in the immediate aftermath of the episode airing. Seth MacFarlane even referenced the South Park parody publicly later that same year, delivering a commencement speech at Harvard University in character as Stewie Griffin, where he acknowledged the manatee joke directly and confirmed that the show's cutaway gags were included purely for the sake of humor, rather than to advance any larger plot, a comment that could be read either as a lighthearted acceptance of the criticism or as a direct defense of the format on its own terms. The show's actual on-screen response did not arrive until 2009, 3 years after Cartoon Wars originally aired. That response came in the form of an episode called Spies Reminiscent of Us, which included a storyline built around Peter and his neighbor Quagmire, both voiced by Seth MacFarlane, participating in an improv comedy show together. During this segment, Peter repeatedly gets big, loud laughs from the crowd by using exactly the kind of quick, out-of-context, pre-written style gags that Family Guy had become known for, and that Parker and Stone had specifically criticized. Quagmire, meanwhile, tries to push the improv show toward a more traditional, character-based style of comedy, encouraging the kind of situational, story-driven jokes that closely resemble the argument Cartman had made while undercover in the Family Guy studio 3 years earlier. In the episode, Quagmire's more traditional approach gets a noticeably weaker response from the crowd, compared to Peter's gag-heavy style, a detail that reads as Family Guy directly answering the argument at the heart of Cartoon Wars, suggesting that audiences actually respond better to the exact style of humor Parker and Stone had dismissed as lazy and random. This back and forth between the two shows did not stay confined to the episodes themselves. Both creative teams have discussed the feud repeatedly in interviews over the years that followed, and the tone of those comments has remained fairly consistent across nearly 2 decades. In a 2012 interview with Rolling Stone, Seth MacFarlane addressed the way Parker and Stone had portrayed his show in Cartoon Wars, saying he actually felt flattered by some of the specific attention the episode gave to Family Guy's format, while also expressing confusion about certain personal comments Parker and Stone had made about him directly, comments that went beyond simply critiquing the show's writing style and moved into more personal territory. This response shows a more complicated reaction than a simple rivalry narrative might suggest. MacFarlane accepting parts of the criticism as fair, while pushing back on parts that felt like they crossed into personal attacks rather than professional disagreement. Parker and Stone, for their part, have never really softened their original position. In later interviews, including one conducted years after Cartoon Wars first aired, both creators reaffirmed that they specifically disliked being compared to Family Guy, arguing that despite surface similarities, meaning that both shows are animated, both feature crude humor, and both center around dysfunctional families, the actual writing philosophy behind the two shows had almost nothing in common. Stone has been quoted describing Family Guy's writing staff as clearly talented people who nonetheless leaned constantly on what he considered the easiest, laziest possible version of a joke, rather than pushing themselves to write something built more directly around character and story. This criticism repeats itself across interviews spanning more than a decade, suggesting that the frustration behind Cartoon Wars was not a one-time joke made for a single episode, but a genuine, long-held creative disagreement that Parker and Stone continued to bring up whenever the topic of Family Guy came up in conversation. The feud has occasionally shown up in smaller, less direct ways across both shows over the years as well. In one South Park episode called Canada on Strike, the show briefly features Family Guy appearing on television for only a few seconds before Cartman angrily refuses to let the group resort to watching it, treating even the mention of the show as something to be avoided. On the Family Guy side, in an episode called Road to Germany, the show included a specific joke involving a campaign pin referencing the 2008 presidential election between Barack Obama and John McCain, paired with Sarah Palin. Trey Parker later credited that specific joke as part of what inspired a South Park episode called About Last Night, which aired the night after the 2008 election and accurately accurately predicted an Obama win using a similarly styled joke, with Parker describing the original Family Guy gag in less than favorable terms, even while admitting it had influenced his own team's later work. What makes this feud particularly relevant to the larger story of Family Guy's changing reputation is how closely the criticism lines up with concerns that had already started surfacing elsewhere by the mid to late 2000s. Critics reviewing seasons 5 through 7 had already begun raising similar points about the show relying too heavily on pop culture references and disconnected gags, rather than tightly written stories. The exact same argument Parker and Stone were making through the manatee joke in Cartoon Wars.
This overlap suggests that South Park was not simply attacking Family Guy out of professional jealousy or a desire to distance itself from constant comparisons. The criticism reflected something that television critics, industry insiders, and even some of Family Guy's own longtime viewers were beginning to notice on their own. A pattern of leaning on quick, standalone jokes, rather than consistently building episodes around strong character work and a clear story. There is also evidence that other people working inside the television industry at the time appreciated seeing this criticism aired publicly. According to reporting on the reaction inside other animated writers' rooms, staff members from both The Simpsons and King of the Hill reportedly reached out to Parker and Stone after Cartoon Wars aired, thanking them for putting into words a frustration that writers on other shows had apparently been feeling privately for a while. This detail matters because it shows that the criticism embedded in Cartoon Wars was not simply Parker and Stone settling a personal grudge against a single rival. It reflected a broader sentiment already circulating quietly within the small world of adult animated comedy writers, one that Cartoon Wars simply made loud and public for the first time. The feud has continued to resurface periodically in interviews well beyond its original 2006 flashpoint, showing up again as recently as 2025. During an appearance on a podcast that year, McFarlane discussed South Park's continued cultural relevance, specifically praising the show's ability to react to current events with unusual speed, noting how quickly Parker and Stone's production process allows them to respond to breaking news compared to the much longer production timeline required for Family Guy's more traditional animation process. Even while making that comparison, McFarlane acknowledged the long-running tension between the two creative teams directly, describing the ongoing disagreement as something that has simply become a permanent, well-known part of both shows' histories at this point, rather than something either side expects to fully resolve. Looking back at this entire episode of television history with the benefit of nearly 2 decades of hindsight, Cartoon Wars stands out as more than just a clever joke aimed at a competitor. It represents one of the earliest and most public moments where the exact criticism that would eventually define much of the conversation around Family Guy's later seasons, the idea that the show increasingly relied on random, disconnected gags rather than character-driven storytelling, was spoken directly and loudly by another major creative team working in the same industry. Family Guy's writers absorbed the joke, referenced it themselves, and eventually built an entire retaliatory storyline defending their format 3 years later. But the underlying argument at the center of Cartoon Wars never really went away. It kept surfacing in interviews, kept getting repeated by Parker and Stone independently of any new controversy, and kept lining up with what critics were separately saying about specific seasons and specific episodes as the show continued its run through the late 2000s and beyond. This particular chapter of the show's history also highlights something important about where criticism of Family Guy was coming from during this stretch of its run. Unlike some of the show's most well-known controversies, which came from outside groups objecting to specific jokes on moral or decency grounds, the criticism at the heart of Cartoon Wars came from directly within the same industry, from a creative team working in the exact same format, using the exact same tools, but building their show around a fundamentally different philosophy. That distinction gives this particular conflict a different kind of weight compared to some of the other controversies that would follow, since it was not about whether a joke crossed a line of good taste, but about whether the entire structure of the show's humor was fundamentally built on a weaker creative foundation than it appeared to be on the surface. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. While this creative disagreement played out through pointed episodes, interviews, and years of ongoing tension between two of the biggest names in adult animation, a completely different kind of criticism had already been building against Family Guy since its very earliest days on the air. One focused not on the structure of its jokes, but on the content of those jokes directly, and it was about to escalate into an official campaign that would follow the show across multiple entire seasons. Section 6, The Parents Television Council Target, 2000 to 2007. While critics inside the television industry were quietly questioning Family Guy's writing style, a completely different kind of opponent had already been fighting the show from the outside since its very first season, and this fight had nothing to do with whether the jokes were clever or lazy. It had everything to do with whether
whether the jokes should be allowed on television at all. That opponent was the Parents Television Council, often shortened to the PTC, a non-profit group that describes itself as a watchdog organization focused on the content of American television. The group had built its reputation around monitoring network programming for material its members considered offensive, indecent, or harmful, particularly content they believed children might be exposed to during normal viewing hours. Family Guy became one of the group's most frequent and most consistent targets, almost from the moment it went on the air, and that relationship stretched on for years, following the show through its early struggling seasons, its cancellation, its comeback, and well into its most successful creative stretch. The very first documented clash between the PTC and Family Guy happened in the year 2000 during the show's second season. At that point, the PTC pushed Fox directly, encouraging the network to cancel the show entirely. The group's argument at the time pointed to what they described as strong resistance from advertisers, combined with the show's already low ratings, framing the show as both commercially weak and morally objectionable at the exact same time. This early campaign happened before Family Guy had built any real cultural momentum, while the show was still just a struggling new program trying to find its footing on Sunday nights. The PTC was not attacking an established hit. It was attacking a show that was already fighting for its life against low viewership, adding one more pressure point onto a program that Fox was already close to giving up on. Family Guy survived that early period, only to be formally canceled twice more before its eventual comeback in 2005, and the PTC did not lose interest in the show during its years away from television. Once new episodes started airing again, the organization picked right back up where it had left off. Family Guy ended up appearing on the PTC's list of worst primetime shows for family viewing in the years 2000, 2005, and 2006, a recurring pattern that shows this was not a single angry reaction to one bad episode, but a sustained, ongoing campaign that followed the show across multiple different points in its history. The scale of this campaign becomes clearer when looking at how often the PTC specifically labeled individual episodes as the worst television show of the week, a title the group handed out regularly to programs it found most objectionable at any given moment. According to tracking done on the group's own public statements, Family Guy received this specific label on at least 40 separate occasions since 2005 alone. 40 individual episodes being singled out by name over the course of a single organization's ongoing criticism is an unusually high number, especially considering that many other shows on television during this same period rarely appeared on this kind of list even once. This pattern suggests the PTC was not simply reacting occasionally to an especially shocking episode. The group appears to have been actively watching the show on close to a weekly basis, looking for material to flag as part of an ongoing, deliberate effort. The 2006 to 2007 television season represents the point where this criticism reached its peak. The PTC officially named Family Guy the single worst show of that entire season, a title that placed the show above every other program airing on American television at the time in terms of how objectionable the group found its content. This label did not come from a single controversial episode. It reflected a full season's worth of material that the organization had been tracking and criticizing episode by episode, building toward a final judgment that placed Family Guy at the very top of its list of concerns for that particular year. Around this same period, the PTC extended its criticism beyond the regular animated series and toward a related special hosted by Seth MacFarlane and fellow cast member Alex Borstein, titled Family Guy Presents Seth and Alex's Almost Live Comedy Show. This special also received the Worst Television Show of the Week label from the PTC, with the organization specifically citing what it described as disgusting sex jokes, crude Holocaust-related humor, cruel mockery aimed at deaf individuals, and heavy use of bleeped profanity throughout the special. The fact that the PTC's criticism extended beyond the core animated series and into a live-action spin-off project shows how closely the group was tracking everything connected to the Family Guy brand during this stretch, rather than focusing narrowly on the animated episodes alone. Beyond simply labeling episodes and issuing public statements, the PTC also took more formal legal action against the show by filing indecency complaints directly with the Federal Communications Commission, the government agency responsible for regulating broadcast content in the United States. These complaints represent a more serious step than a public statement or a worst show ranking, since they involve an actual attempt to trigger a government review of specific episodes for potential violations of federal broadcast decency law. Over the years, the PTC filed formal FCC complaints against several individual Family Guy episodes by name. One of the clearest examples of
this pattern involved an episode called Family Gay, which originally aired on March 8th, 2009. On March 11th of that same year, just 3 days after the episode aired, the PTC filed a formal complaint with the FCC over its content. This particular episode generated an unusually large public response as part of the PTC's campaign, with the organization successfully encouraging its members to file more than 188,000 individual complaints with the FCC, a number that stands out dramatically compared to typical indecency complaint totals for a single television episode. PTC President Tim Winter specifically described the episode's content in his public statement, citing a scene the group characterized as a large-scale sexual encounter, along with a separate scene showing Stewie eating cereal poured with a bodily fluid rather than milk. Despite the massive volume of complaints generated by this specific campaign, the FCC ultimately declined to take any formal action against Fox or against the episode, a decision that effectively closed out this particular case without any real legal consequence for the show. This pattern repeated itself with other episodes throughout this general stretch of the show's history. On December 15th, 2009, just 2 days after the episode Business Guy aired, the PTC filed another formal indecency complaint, this time citing a scene involving a lap dance that the group argued violated federal broadcast decency standards. In 2010, following the airing of the show's 150th episode, titled Brian and Stewie, the PTC filed yet another complaint, this time focused specifically on a sequence involving Brian consuming material connected to a diaper-related joke. Tim Winter's public statement about this particular episode argued that McFarlane appeared to have deliberately studied the legal definition of broadcast indecency purely in order to find ways to violate it as directly as possible, a comment that framed the show's writing not as accidental controversy, but as intentional, calculated provocation aimed squarely at existing broadcast rules. Not every FCC complaint filed against the show resulted in the same outcome, and looking at how these cases were actually resolved gives a clearer picture of how seriously the government agency responsible for enforcing decency rules actually took these specific complaints. In one notable case involving an episode called And the Wiener Is, the FCC formally reviewed the PTC's complaint and ultimately denied it. The agency's official written decision explained that although the word for a specific body part and various indirect ways of referring to it were repeated multiple times throughout the episode, the material lacked any explicit or graphic visual description or depiction of that body part, and the agency did not find the episode shocking, exploitative, or designed purely to provoke outrage when viewed as a complete episode, rather than judged only on isolated lines pulled out of context. Based on that reasoning, the FCC concluded the episode did not meet the legal definition of indecency under current broadcast standards, closing out that particular complaint without any penalty. This same basic pattern repeated across nearly every formal complaint the PTC filed against the show over the years. The organization would file a complaint, sometimes generating a large volume of supporting complaints from its own membership base, and the FCC would eventually review the material and issue a decision. In case after case, the agency ultimately declined to take formal action against Fox or against the specific episodes being challenged, a pattern that held consistent even through some of the most heavily publicized complaints the PTC filed during this entire stretch of years. This outcome does not mean the PTC's criticism had no real effect on how the show was perceived publicly. Even without a formal government penalty attached, each new complaint added to a growing public record of controversy surrounding the show, contributing to its reputation as one of the most consistently challenged programs on network television, regardless of how the individual legal cases were eventually resolved. The PTC also raised concerns that went beyond individual jokes and touched on how the show was being marketed and rated for audiences. The organization specifically criticized Fox for what it described as a failure to properly label certain Family Guy episodes with content descriptors meant to warn viewers about sexual content or violence contained within a given episode. Descriptors that are part of the standard television content rating system used across most American networks. The PTC argued that Fox was not applying these specific labels consistently to Family Guy episodes, which the group believed left parents without clear enough warning about what their children might encounter if they happened to be watching. Alongside this concern, the PTC repeatedly cautioned that the show's animated format specifically posed a risk of drawing in younger viewers who might mistake the cartoon style for children's programming, despite its clearly adult subject matter and mature language throughout. One specific instance highlights how far this conflict extended into direct engagement between the two sides, rather than remaining purely a one-sided campaign of complaints and public statements. Following the airing of an episode titled Our Idiot Brian in 2010,
2015, the PTC again publicly criticized the show over a specific joke involving anatomy that appeared near the end of the episode. In an unusual response, Seth MacFarlane reportedly extended a direct offer to PTC president Tim Winter, inviting him to either write an episode of the show himself or to select 2 writers of his own choosing to take on that task.
This surprising offer reportedly stunned Winter, and according to later reporting, the exchange that followed led to a genuine conversation between MacFarlane and the PTC, one where MacFarlane reportedly listened to some of the organization's underlying concerns directly. This particular moment stands out from the broader history of the conflict, since it represents one of the only documented instances where the ongoing tension between Family Guy and its most persistent critic shifted, even briefly, from public statements and legal complaints into an actual direct conversation between the two sides. Family Guy itself did not stay silent throughout this entire period either, and the show occasionally responded to the PTC's criticism directly within its own episodes. One episode, titled PTV, was built specifically as a satirical response to the PTC's ongoing campaign and to broader concerns about government censorship of television content more generally. This episode drew enough continued attention from the PTC that the organization reportedly considered filing yet another formal complaint over its content when it later aired as a rerun, ultimately naming that particular rerun as one of its worst of the week selections as well. In a separate episode called The 2,000-Year-Old Virgin, the show included a direct joke referencing an organization called the Family Television Council, a thinly disguised stand-in clearly meant to represent the real Parents Television Council, showing that the show's own writers were fully aware of who their most consistent critic was and were willing to poke fun at that relationship directly within their own material. Taken as a whole, this stretch of the show's history reveals a very different kind of pressure than the internal creative criticism coming from rival shows like South Park or from television critics questioning the show's writing quality. The PTC's campaign was not concerned with whether Family Guy's jokes were clever or lazy. It was concerned entirely with whether the specific content of those jokes crossed a line that the organization believed should not be crossed on broadcast television, regardless of how well or how poorly any individual joke happened to be written. This distinction matters because it shows that Family Guy was facing criticism from multiple completely different directions throughout its most successful years. One line of attack focused on the structure and quality of its comedy, and an entirely separate line of attack focused purely on the moral and legal boundaries of its content, both running simultaneously across many of the exact same seasons. None of this organized outside pressure ever succeeded in getting the show pulled from the air, and despite dozens of worst show labels, numerous formal FCC complaints, and repeated public campaigns spanning years, Family Guy kept airing new episodes and kept growing its audience throughout this entire period. The FCC's repeated pattern of declining to take formal action against the show meant that, from a strictly legal standpoint, none of this pressure ever forced any real change in how the show operated, or what kind of material it was allowed to include in future episodes. But the sheer volume and consistency of this outside criticism, stretching from the show's earliest struggling seasons all the way through its most commercially successful years, added another layer to the show's growing public reputation, one built specifically around controversy and pushing boundaries, separate entirely from any questions about whether individual episodes were actually funny or well written. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. While the PTC continued filing its complaints and issuing its rankings year after year without ever managing to change the show's course, an entirely different kind of controversy was building quietly within the show's own fan base, one that would eventually force the writers into a decision no outside watchdog group had ever come close to achieving. Section 7, Killing Brian, Life of Brian and the Fan Revolt, Season 12, 2013. By the time Family Guy reached its 12th season, the show had survived cancellations, weathered years of criticism from the Parents Television Council, absorbed direct public mockery from South Park, and settled into a long, steady run as one of Fox's most dependable programs. Nothing in that history had ever forced the writers to reverse a major creative decision within weeks of making it. That changed in November 2013, when the show made a choice that produced a reaction unlike anything it had faced before. Not from an outside watchdog group, and not from a rival show, but from its own audience. The episode responsible for this reaction was called Life of Brian, the 6th episode of Season 12, which originally aired on November 24th, 2013. The plot begins in familiar territory for the show. Brian and Stewie are preparing to play a game of street hockey together, a simple, low-stakes setup typical of countless earlier episodes involving the two characters. Stewie heads back inside briefly to grab a pair of knee pads, and while he is gone, Brian is struck by a passing car. He is taken to the hospital, where he later dies from his injuries. For a show that had built its identity around cutaway throwaway jokes, exaggerated violence played for laughs, and characters who regularly survive outlandish situations without consequence, this death was staged with an unusually serious tone. The episode largely set aside its usual joke-heavy structure once the accident occurs, choosing instead to focus on the Griffin family's grief in a way that felt noticeably different from the show's typical approach to tragedy. Brian Griffin was not a minor character. He had been part of the show since its very first episode in 1999, serving as one of the primary voices of reason in a family full of exaggerated, often self-destructive personalities. Brian's role in the show went beyond simple comic relief. He was written as intelligent, sarcastic, and deeply human, despite being a dog, frequently acting as a stand-in for the audience's own perspective on the chaos happening around him. Killing off a character with this much history and this much emotional weight was never going to be treated the same way as killing off a minor side character introduced only a season or two earlier. The episode did not leave Brian's role in the family empty for long. Within its own story, following his death, the Griffins bring home a new dog named Vinny, voiced by actor Tony Sirico, who was well known at the time for playing Polly Walnuts on the television series The Sopranos. Vinny was written as a foul-mouthed, distinctly different personality compared to Brian, an intentional contrast meant to highlight just how different life in the Griffin household had become without their original dog. Stewie initially resists forming any bond with Vinny, still processing the loss of his closest companion, but the episode moves towards Stewie slowly warming up to the new dog by its end. On the surface, this all read like a deliberate, permanent shift in the show's core cast, a bold decision to replace one of its most recognizable characters going forward. The reaction from fans arrived almost immediately, and it was far more intense than anything the show's writers appeared to have anticipated. Within hours of the episode airing, a petition appeared on the website change.org, addressed directly to Fox and to Seth MacFarlane, demanding that Brian be brought back. That petition gathered more than 2,000 signatures within its first few hours alone, a pace that showed this was not a slow-building complaint from a small group of dedicated fans, but an immediate, widespread reaction from a large portion of the show's audience reacting in real time. Later reporting on the situation described the petition eventually growing well beyond its initial numbers, with some accounts citing a total exceeding 100,000 signatures as the campaign continued to spread in the days following the episode. Social media reaction matched the intensity of the petition. A Facebook page created specifically around mourning Brian's death, using a title expressing grief over the loss of the character, gathered more than 120,000 likes within a very short window of time after the episode aired. Fans flooded various platforms with comments expressing anger, sadness, and confusion, many directly questioning why the show would choose to permanently remove one of its most beloved characters after 14 years on the air. Specific comments circulating at the time described Brian as an essential part of what made watching the show enjoyable, pointing to his wit and his more grounded personality as something the family dynamic genuinely needed in order to function the way audiences had come to expect. This level of backlash stands out because of how quickly and how visibly it spread compared to typical fan reactions to television deaths. Killing off a major character is not a new idea in television storytelling, and plenty of long-running shows have written out beloved characters over the years without triggering an organized public campaign demanding their return. What made the reaction to Brian's death different was the sheer speed and scale of the response, moving from initial shock to organized petitions and dedicated social media pages within a matter of hours rather than days or weeks. This suggested that Brian occupied a different kind of role in viewers' minds compared to how they viewed other characters on the show, a character whose loss felt disruptive on a level the writers may not have fully expected going into the episode. Seth MacFarlane later spoke directly about this reaction in public comments, and his remarks reveal that the intensity of the backlash genuinely caught the creative team off guard. He described the entire staff as surprised by how much people still cared about the character, framing this surprise as a positive discovery about the depth of the show's connection with its audience, rather than treating the reaction as an inconvenience or an overreaction. This kind of direct acknowledgement from the show's creator confirms that the backlash was not simply dismissed internally as an overblown internet reaction. It appears to have genuinely registered with the people responsible for making decisions about the show's direction going forward. The response to that pressure came remarkably fast by television production standards. Just 3 weeks after Life of Brian originally aired, the show broadcast an episode titled Christmas Guy on December 15th, 2013, and this episode reversed Brian's death entirely. The resolution came through a time travel storyline involving Stewie, who runs into an alternate version of himself from a different timeline during the episode. This alternate Stewie possesses a working time machine, and the two versions of the character character use it together to travel back to the moment right before the fatal accident, successfully preventing the car from ever hitting Brian in the first place. Once this change takes effect, the timeline resets, erasing the events of both Life of Brian and the weeks that had passed with Vinny as the family's new dog. From the perspective of the show's ongoing storyline, it was as if Brian's death had never happened at all, restoring the original cast dynamic that had existed before the controversial episode aired. The speed of this reversal is worth examining closely, since it says something specific about how quickly this particular franchise could respond to audience pressure compared to typical television production timelines. Most scripted shows work with production schedules planned many months in advance, meaning that reversing a major storyline within 3 weeks of the original episode airing would normally be close to impossible without an unusually flexible production process already in place. The fact that Family Guy managed to write, animate, and air a full episode resolving this controversy within such a short window suggests either that the reversal had already been planned as a possibility before Life of Brian even aired, or that the production team moved with extraordinary speed once the scale of the backlash became clear. Either possibility says something meaningful about how seriously the show's creative team treated this specific reaction compared to previous controversies the show had weathered over the years. Following the broadcast of Christmas Guy, Seth MacFarlane addressed the situation directly through a public statement posted on social media. His message thanked fans for caring as much as they did about what he referred to as the canine member of the Griffin family, and he added a joking comment suggesting the idea that the show would have permanently killed off Brian was never something anyone involved would have seriously considered in the first place. This particular comment generated its own separate reaction among fans and critics, since it appeared to directly contradict the tone of Life of Brian itself, an episode that had been written and presented with unusually serious weight, giving no indication within the story that Brian's death was meant to be treated as anything other than permanent. This contradiction became one of the more debated aspects of the entire controversy once the dust settled. If the show's own creator was suggesting after the fact that killing off Brian permanently had never been a real possibility, then the entire storyline running through Life of Brian and the introduction of Vinny as his replacement began to look to some viewers like a deliberate publicity stunt designed specifically to generate a strong emotional reaction and drive conversation about the show, rather than a genuine creative decision about the direction of the series going forward. Some fans who had initially celebrated Brian's return grew frustrated once this angle became more widely discussed, feeling that the entire arc had manipulated their emotions for the sake of generating buzz, rather than committing to a real storytelling choice in either direction. This criticism raises a specific and important question about how the entire sequence of events should be understood within the larger story of the show's changing relationship with its audience. On one hand, the show demonstrated a genuine willingness to listen to fan reaction and adjust its storytelling in response, something that could be viewed as a positive sign of a creative team paying close attention to what its audience actually wanted. On the other hand, the suggestion that the death was never meant to be permanent in the first place, combined with the unusually fast turnaround time between the 2 episodes, opened the door to the interpretation that the entire storyline had been calculated from the start as a way to generate a temporary wave of attention, rather than representing an honest creative risk that the writers were prepared to fully commit to either way. Regardless of which interpretation is more accurate, the character of Vinny did not disappear entirely once Brian returned. Following Christmas Guy, Vinny continued to make occasional appearances in later episodes, though his role shrank significantly compared to his brief position as a full member of the Griffin household during the weeks Brian was gone. He largely returned to minor, background-style appearances, rather than remaining a consistent presence in the show going forward. This detail reinforces the idea that the entire storyline functioned as a temporary detour, rather than any lasting change to the show's core cast, with Vinny existing mainly as evidence of a choice that was ultimately abandoned once the reaction to it became clear. Looking at this entire episode of the show's history within the larger pattern of criticism building around Family Guy during this period, the Life of Brian controversy stands apart from earlier controversies in one specific way. The backlash against South Park's Cartoon Wars episode focused on the structure and quality of the show's writing. The Parent Television Council's years of complaints focused on the moral and legal boundaries of specific jokes and scenes. The reaction to Life of Brian was different from both of these patterns, since it was not really about whether a joke went too far or whether the writing had grown lazy. It was about the emotional relationship between the audience and one specific character, and about whether the show had the right to take that character away permanently after building 14 years of history and audience connection around him. This distinction matters because it reveals something about how deeply Family Guy's audience had grown attached to certain characters by this point in the show's run, well past past its initial comeback years and deep into its long-term, sustained popularity. A show that had spent years being criticized for relying on shallow, disconnected jokes rather than real character development had, at the exact same time, managed to build a character whose loss provoked one of the largest organized fan reactions in the show's entire history. This suggests that even as critics continued to argue the writing had grown weaker in certain respects, the emotional core of the show, built up gradually across more than a decade of episodes, remained strong enough to generate a passionate, immediate response the moment that core felt genuinely threatened. The financial and commercial side of this controversy also deserves attention, since the entire situation played out in an era where social media reaction could be tracked and measured in ways that simply had not existed during the show's earlier controversies from the 2000s. The scale of the online response to Brian's death, spreading across Facebook, Twitter, and dedicated fan campaigns within hours, reflected how much television fandom itself had changed since Family Guy first premiered in 1999. Earlier controversies involving the Parents Television Council had unfolded mostly through official statements, press releases, and formal complaints filed with a government agency. The Brian controversy unfolded largely through ordinary fans organizing themselves directly online, without needing any formal organization or leadership structure to coordinate a response. This difference highlights how the nature of audience pushback against television decisions had shifted dramatically over the course of the show's own run, moving from organized advocacy groups towards spontaneous, large-scale grassroots reactions, driven entirely by ordinary viewers reacting in real time. None of this ultimately damaged the show's overall popularity or commercial standing. Family Guy continued airing new seasons well beyond this controversy, and the show's ratings did not suffer any lasting collapse as a result of the backlash or its quick resolution. If anything, the sheer amount of conversation generated by both Life of Brian and Christmas Guy likely brought additional attention to the show during a period when it was already many years into its run, a stretch of a series' lifespan where maintaining strong cultural relevance becomes increasingly difficult for almost any long-running program. Whether or not the entire sequence was planned from the start as a way to generate exactly this kind of attention, the practical result was a brief spike in public conversation about a show that had already been on the air in one form or another for well over a decade at that point. What this controversy does reveal clearly is a specific vulnerability that had built up quietly within the show over its many years of continuous production. A series that leans heavily on shock value and boundary-pushing content runs the risk of eventually testing a boundary that its own audience is not willing to accept, even from a show that had built its entire reputation around pushing exactly those kinds of boundaries in the first place. Family Guy had spent years testing limits set by outside groups like the Parents Television Council, and had spent years absorbing criticism from rival creators questioning its writing structure. The Brian controversy showed that the show's own fans represented a different kind of limit entirely, one built not around legal decency standards or professional writing critiques, but around years of accumulated emotional investment in specific characters that the show could not simply discard without facing a serious and immediate reaction. This particular controversy also set a pattern that would echo in different ways during other moments later in the show's run, moments where fan reaction to a specific creative choice grew loud enough that it became a defining part of how that stretch of episodes would be remembered. The speed and intensity of the response to Brian's death demonstrated just how closely fans were now watching the show, and how quickly that attention could organize into something the network and the creative team felt compelled to respond to directly. A dynamic that stood in sharp contrast to the show's early years, when its survival depended far more on quiet DVD sales and late-night cable reruns than on any kind of real-time audience reaction. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. While this particular controversy resolved quickly and without any lasting damage to the show's core cast, it exposed a much older and more uncomfortable set of criticisms about specific jokes buried throughout the show's history. Criticisms that had nothing to do with character deaths or emotional attachment, and everything to do with material that had not aged well at all in the years since it first aired. Section 8. Dated Jokes, Stereotypes, and the Aging Problem. Season 11 and beyond. Every long-running comedy eventually runs into the same problem. Even when nothing about its production changes, and nothing about its writing staff falls apart. Jokes that felt normal or even edgy at the time they were written can start to feel completely different once enough years have passed and public attitudes have shifted around them.
Family Guy, a show that built its entire identity on pushing past normal boundaries of taste, ran into this exact problem repeatedly across its run, and one specific episode from season 11 has become one of the clearest examples critics point to when discussing how certain jokes on the show simply have not held up over time. That episode is called Turban Cowboy, the 15th episode of season 11, which originally aired on March 17th, 2013. It was written by Artie Johan and Sean Reese, and directed by Joe Vox. The episode opens with Peter taking up skydiving as a new hobby after growing bored with his usual routine at the Drunken Clam. A skydiving accident in Las Vegas leaves him hospitalized, and while recovering, he meets a fellow patient named Mahmoud, played by guest actor Omid Abtahi. The two men quickly become friends, and Peter finds himself drawn to Mahmoud's calm demeanor, and specifically to the way Mahmoud's wife behaves toward her husband. This detail becomes a spark for the episode's central plot, as Peter begins studying Islam and eventually decides he wants to convert. From this point, the episode moves through a series of plot beats that many critics reviewing it at the time found deeply predictable. Peter becomes fully invested in his new faith, largely because he is drawn to surface-level ideas about religious clothing and about the obedience he perceives in Mahmoud's marriage, rather than any deeper spiritual interest. His friends Joe and Quagmire grow suspicious of Mahmoud almost immediately, voicing concerns that Peter dismisses as unfair or prejudiced. The episode eventually reveals that Mahmoud is secretly involved with a group planning a terrorist attack, and Peter finds himself unknowingly caught up in the plot simply because of his new friendship. By the episode's end, Joe and Quagmire's suspicions turn out to have been entirely correct. Critics reviewing the episode at the time it aired were largely unified in their reaction, and that reaction was overwhelmingly negative regarding how the show handled its central plotline. One review specifically described the episode as feeling like something written a decade earlier and left unused on a shelf, arguing that it seemed almost unaware of how common and how tired the pattern of depicting Middle Eastern characters as secret terrorists had already become in popular entertainment by 2013. Another reviewer described the episode as relying on easy, obvious stereotypes about Muslim men specifically being seen as controlling toward women and secretly connected to violence, arguing that the show seemed to be reaching for shock value through a well-worn pattern rather than doing anything genuinely new or thoughtful with the subject matter. The episode does include a moment that appears aimed at softening this criticism from within its own story. Character Joe delivers a line acknowledging that not every person belonging to a particular group should be judged based on the actions of a violent few, a comment meant to suggest the show was not arguing that all Muslim characters should be viewed with suspicion. Several critics and viewers who examined this specific moment afterward pointed out that this message directly contradicts the episode's own plot, since the entire story is built around Joe and Quagmire being right to suspect Mahmoud from the very beginning, undermining any message about avoiding unfair judgment that the show appeared to be trying to include. This kind of contradiction, where a show includes a brief line defending a broader point while its actual story does the opposite, became one of the most frequently cited criticisms of the episode among people analyzing its content after it aired. There is also a specific detail about this episode that became more uncomfortable simply due to timing rather than anything the writers could have controlled. The episode includes a joke referencing the Boston Marathon, delivered in a lighthearted way typical of the show's usual style. Less than a month after this episode aired, a real bombing attack took place at the Boston Marathon in April 2013, an event that killed several people and injured many more. Once that real tragedy occurred, the earlier joke referencing the marathon took on an entirely different and far more uncomfortable tone for anyone rewatching the episode afterward, turning what had been an ordinary throwaway line into something that reads as deeply insensitive in hindsight, even though nothing about the joke itself had actually changed. This kind of situation, where outside real-world events transform how an existing joke lands, represents a different kind of aging problem compared to jokes that simply reflect outdated social attitudes, since it shows how quickly and unpredictably a piece of comedy can shift in tone due to circumstances completely outside anyone's control at the time of writing. Turban Cowboy is far from the only episode in the show's long history that has drawn this specific kind of criticism, though it stands out as one of the more frequently cited examples due to how directly its plot leans into stereotypes about a specific religious group. Critics writing broader retrospectives about the show's history have pointed to a consistent pattern across many seasons involving jokes built around religious groups more generally, arguing that this kind kind of humor was especially common during the show's earlier seasons and has aged particularly poorly as social attitudes toward religious tolerance and representation have shifted in the years since those episodes first aired. What made Turban Cowboy stand out enough to draw this level of specific attention, even years after its original airing, was the way it combined religious stereotyping directly with the especially sensitive subject of terrorism, a combination that critics argued crossed further into harmful territory than many of the show's more general religious jokes from earlier seasons. This particular pattern of criticism connects to a larger, ongoing conversation about how Family Guy's comedy has been received differently depending on when a viewer happens to be watching a given episode. An episode that drew relatively mild criticism or even genuine laughs when it first aired can end up being viewed completely differently by a new audience discovering the show years later, arriving with a different cultural context and a different set of expectations about how certain groups should be portrayed on television. This creates an unusual challenge, specifically for long-running shows like Family Guy, since a series that has been continuously producing new episodes for more than 2 decades ends up carrying its entire back catalog forward with it, meaning older episodes remain just as easily accessible to new viewers as anything airing currently, even though those older episodes were written under very different social conditions. The show's own internal handling of the Turban Cowboy episode across different release formats reflects an awareness that some of its content needed adjustment, even shortly after its original broadcast. Comparing the version of the episode that aired on television against the version later included on home video releases reveals several specific changes, mostly involving language that was censored for broadcast but left uncensored on the DVD release. While these particular changes were about profanity rather than the episode's broader stereotyping, they show that the show's own production team was actively managing different versions of the same episode for different audiences and different release formats, a detail that reflects the constant tension the show operated under between pushing boundaries and staying within whatever limits a given broadcast platform required at the time. Beyond this specific episode, the broader criticism aimed at Family Guy's handling of religious and ethnic material extends across many different seasons and many different specific jokes, forming a consistent pattern that critics have pointed to repeatedly throughout the show's history, rather than treating any single episode as an isolated incident. Earlier seasons of the show included numerous jokes built around religious stereotypes involving various groups, material that drew far less organized criticism at the time it originally aired, compared to how audiences and critics tend to respond to similar material today. This shift does not necessarily mean the show's writing changed dramatically over the years in how it approached this kind of humor. It reflects, at least in part, a broader shift in how audiences generally respond to this style of joke, with material that might have passed without much comment in the mid-2000s, drawing far more direct and organized criticism by the time the show reached its 11th season and beyond. This raises an important distinction worth making clearly. Not every piece of criticism aimed at Family Guy's older material reflects a change in the show's own writing approach. Some of it reflects a genuine shift in how audiences generally view this kind of content over time, meaning the show's writing style around certain sensitive topics may have remained fairly consistent across many years, while the surrounding cultural context shifted significantly around it. This distinction matters when trying to understand the full picture of why certain episodes have developed reputations as aging poorly, since it separates cases where the show's own choices grew noticeably worse from cases where public standards simply moved in a different direction than where the show's humor had always operated. At the same time, some critics have specifically argued that episodes like Turban Cowboy represent something different from this general pattern, since the episode aired well into the show's run, long after other forms of media had already begun moving away from this specific kind of terrorism-related stereotype involving Middle Eastern characters. This argument suggests that Turban Cowboy was not simply a product of its era in the same way some of the show's earlier material might be described. It was criticized specifically because, even by the standards of 2013, this kind of storyline already felt outdated and predictable to many viewers and critics who had grown tired of seeing the same basic pattern repeated across various forms of entertainment for years by that point. This particular criticism connects directly back to concerns raised much earlier in the show's history about its reliance on familiar patterns rather than fresh material, the same basic argument South Park had raised years earlier through its manatee joke in Cartoon Wars. Whether the specific complaint involves stereotypical characters, predictable plot twists, or overly familiar joke structures, a consistent thread running through much of the criticism aimed at Family Guy across its later seasons involves the idea that the show increasingly leaned on well-worn, easily predictable patterns rather than continuing to push its writing
writing in genuinely new directions. Turban Cowboy fits neatly into this broader pattern, since much of the criticism aimed at the episode focused specifically on how predictable and familiar its central twist felt, rather than treating the episode as some kind of unprecedented misstep, completely disconnected from everything else critics had already been saying about the show's writing for years. It is also worth acknowledging that Family Guy has, at various points throughout its history, attempted to include moments within specific episodes meant to push back against accusations of pure stereotyping, inserting lines or brief scenes meant to complicate or soften the more stereotypical elements of a given storyline. The line from Joe in Turban Cowboy, acknowledging that not every member of a group should be judged by the actions of a violent minority, represents exactly this kind of attempted balance. Critics who examine these moments closely across multiple episodes have generally argued that these brief additions rarely succeed in meaningfully offsetting the broader stereotypes embedded in the surrounding plot, since the actual story being told frequently ends up reinforcing the very pattern the brief dialogue claims to be pushing back against. This creates a recurring structural problem, where individual episodes appear to want credit for acknowledging a stereotype exists, while simultaneously building their entire plot directly around that same stereotype, proving accurate by the episode's end. Looking at this specific stretch of criticism within the show's larger history reveals something important about how a long-running series accumulates different kinds of vulnerability over time. Early seasons faced criticism mostly focused on general crudeness and broad indecency concerns from groups like the Parents Television Council. Later seasons, once the show had been running long enough to build a massive back catalog of episodes covering countless different topics and countless different groups, began facing a more specific kind of criticism, focused directly on how particular jokes handled particular communities. Criticism that grew louder and more organized as public conversations about representation and stereotyping in media became more prominent across the broader entertainment industry during this same period. None of this criticism ever resulted in the kind of organized campaign or formal government complaint that had followed the show during its earlier years through the Parents Television Council's efforts. There was no equivalent FCC filing process built specifically to address concerns about religious or ethnic stereotyping, in the same way there was for concerns about explicit sexual content or violence. This meant that criticism aimed at episodes like Turban Cowboy tended to live almost entirely within critical reviews, opinion pieces, and ongoing fan discussion, rather than through any formal complaint process capable of producing an official ruling on the matter one way or another. This gave this specific category of criticism a quieter, more diffuse presence compared to the louder, more official battles the show had fought with regulators and watchdog groups in earlier years, even though the underlying concerns being raised were, in many cases, treated by critics as more serious and more substantive than some of the earlier complaints about crude language or explicit content. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. This entire pattern reflects an aging problem almost unavoidable for any comedy that stays on air long enough to outlast the cultural moment its earliest jokes were written for. Family Guy's massive back catalog carries every era of its own writing forward at once. While episodes like Turban Cowboy drew criticism for tired stereotypes, a separate criticism was building at the same time, focused not on any single episode's content, but on the basic structure of how the show told its stories at all. Section 9. The Meta Turn. Breaking the Fourth Wall. Later seasons. Every scripted show operates inside an imaginary boundary that separates the story being told from the audience watching it unfold. This boundary is often referred to as the fourth wall, a term borrowed from theater that describes the invisible barrier between the actors performing on stage and the people sitting in the audience watching them. Breaking the fourth wall means a character acknowledges that boundary directly, whether by looking straight into the camera, commenting on the fact that they are part of a television show, or referencing something about the production itself rather than staying fully inside the fictional world the story is supposed to be building. Family Guy had used this technique occasionally throughout its entire run, but by the time the show reached its later seasons, this specific style of joke had grown far more common, and it became one of the most frequently cited criticisms aimed at the show's structure during this stretch of its history. The show's use of this technique did not appear suddenly in its later years. Even during the celebrated seasons following the show's 2005 comeback, Family Guy occasionally leaned on jokes that acknowledged its own existence as a television program. One frequently cited example comes from the Season 8 episode Dial Meg for Murder, in which Peter signs up to participate in a local rodeo and directly points to a printed copy of TV Guide, a real magazine that used to publish detailed weekly television schedules, to justify his decision to Lois by noting that the show's own listed description for that week's episode already confirmed
confirmed he would end up in trouble at the rodeo. This kind of joke works because it treats the show itself as a known, established object that the characters are somehow aware of, blurring the line between the fictional Griffin family and the real television program viewers were watching them in. Jokes like this appeared periodically across many different seasons, without drawing much organized criticism on their own. A single fourth wall joke dropped into an otherwise normal episode tends to read as a clever, self-aware moment, rather than a structural problem with the show's writing. Viewers largely treated these moments as fun little winks, rather than signs of anything deeper going on with the direction of the series. The show continued using this technique in small doses across many seasons, occasionally having characters directly reference the audience, acknowledge specific network restrictions on language, or comment on things like ratings, censorship, or the show's own production schedule. What changed in the show's later seasons, particularly from around season 16 onward and continuing through seasons 18 and 19, was how frequently this specific style of joke began appearing within individual episodes, and how much weight the writing seemed to place on this kind of humor compared to more traditional, character-driven storytelling. Rather than functioning as an occasional, clever aside dropped into an episode built primarily around a normal plot, meta-humor, referencing the show's own existence, its own history, or its own place within the broader television landscape, began showing up with much greater regularity, to the point where critics reviewing these seasons specifically flagged this shift as one of the defining features of the show's later era. One widely read retrospective covering every season of the show's run specifically singled out this pattern as a growing problem in seasons 18 and 19. According to this analysis, the show had increasingly turned into what the reviewer described as a meta-humor program, one that leaned heavily on jokes commenting on itself and on basic political commentary, rather than continuing to build its comedy around what the reviewer described as the idiotic, chaotic behavior of the quahog community that had defined the show's strongest earlier seasons. This specific criticism draws a direct line between the show's increasing reliance on self-referential jokes and a corresponding decline in the kind of character-focused, situation-driven humor that longtime fans associated with the show's best material from its earlier comeback years. This criticism connects in an interesting way back to the exact argument South Park had made through its Cartoon Wars episode more than a decade earlier. That episode had criticized Family Guy for building its jokes around random, disconnected material rather than humor tied directly to plot and character. The later season's turn toward heavy fourth wall breaking represents a related but distinct version of this same basic problem. Rather than simply using unrelated cutaway gags disconnected from the plot, as the manatee joke had specifically mocked, the show's later seasons increasingly built jokes around commenting on the show's own existence and its own place within the television landscape. A different kind of self-reference that still shares the same basic quality of pulling attention away from the actual story or characters and redirecting it towards something happening outside the fictional world entirely. This shift becomes easier to understand when looking at the sheer number of episodes the show had produced by the time it reached these later seasons. Season 16 alone contained the full slate of episodes covering storylines involving Peter running for local political office, Stewie developing sudden superpowers, and Quagmire going through an unexpected career change, all while continuing what one summary specifically described as the show's habit of breaking the fourth wall and parodying current pop culture and news events. By this point in its run, the show had been on the air, counting both its original run and its post-revival seasons, for well over 15 years. A show operating for that long inevitably develops a massive shared history with its own audience, one built around inside references, running jokes, and a shared understanding between the writers and longtime viewers about what the show has already done and what its characters have already been through. This kind of accumulated history creates a natural pull towards self-referential humor that newer shows simply do not have access to. A series in its third or fourth season cannot easily make jokes about its own long-running reputation, its own history of controversy, or its own place within the broader landscape of adult animated comedy, because it has not been around long enough to have built up that kind of history in the first place. Family Guy, by contrast, had accumulated close to 2 decades of episodes, controversies, cast changes, and cultural moments by the time it reached its later seasons, giving its writers an enormous pool of material to draw from purely by referencing the show's own past, rather than generating entirely new story ideas from scratch. This explains part of why the show's later seasons leaned more heavily into this kind of humor, but it does not fully address why critics viewed this shift as a decline, rather than simply a natural evolution for a long-running series. The specific
specific criticism raised in reviews of seasons 18 and 19 was not simply that the show referenced itself more often. It was that this kind of humor increasingly replaced the character-driven storytelling that had defined the show's strongest earlier seasons, rather than existing alongside it as one ingredient among many. A show that leans on jokes about its own existence as a television program, rather than jokes rooted in what its characters actually want, fear, or struggle with, risks losing the specific quality that made those earlier seasons memorable in the first place. The sense that Peter, Lois, Stewie, Brian, Chris, and Meg were functioning as real, consistent personalities, reacting to situations in ways that felt true to who they were established to be. The political commentary specifically mentioned in this criticism represents another related shift worth examining directly. Family Guy had always included jokes touching on political and social topics throughout its history, but the specific complaint raised about later seasons involved the shift toward what was described as basic and underwhelming commentary, suggesting the political material had become less sharp or insightful compared to earlier seasons, while also taking up more space within individual episodes than it previously had. Combined with the increased reliance on fourth wall breaking, this created a version of the show that spent more time commenting directly on real-world events and on its own existence as a program, and comparatively less time telling character-driven stories about the Griffin family navigating absurd but internally consistent situations within Quahog. It is worth being precise about what this criticism does and does not claim. It does not suggest that Family Guy abandoned traditional storytelling entirely during these later seasons. The show continued producing full episodes built around recognizable plots, continued developing storylines involving its established cast of characters, and continued mixing in the kind of cutaway gags that had defined its style since its earliest seasons. The criticism is more specific than a claim that the show simply stopped telling stories. It argues that the balance within individual episodes shifted, with self-referential and topical political material taking up a larger share of each episode's runtime, compared to the tightly written, character-focused plots that had defined the show's most celebrated earlier seasons. This kind of gradual shift in balance is difficult to point to through any single dramatic example, which is part of why this particular criticism reads differently compared to something like the Life of Brian controversy, or the specific backlash aimed at an episode like Turban Cowboy. There is no single fourth wall joke or single meta reference that critics point to as the moment everything changed. Instead, this criticism describes a slow accumulation across many episodes and many seasons, one that only becomes fully visible when looking back at a large stretch of the show's later run all at once, rather than judging any individual episode in isolation. This pattern also connects to a broader question that applies to almost any long-running comedy show once it reaches a certain age. A series that has already explored countless storylines involving its main characters over the course of 2 decades eventually faces a genuine creative challenge in finding new, meaningfully different situations to place those same characters in. Leaning on self-aware humor, jokes about the show's own history, or direct references to real-world events happening at the time of writing offers writers a reliable alternative source of material that does not require inventing an entirely new situation for Peter or Stewie to find themselves in. This does not necessarily make the resulting jokes bad on their own terms, but it does represent a different creative approach compared to building an episode primarily around an original situation specific to the Griffin family and their particular dynamic. The 20th season of the show, which aired specifically to mark the show's 20th anniversary on the air, represents an interesting point within this broader pattern. A season built specifically around celebrating the show's own long history naturally invites exactly the kind of self-referential material that critics had already been flagging as an increasingly dominant feature of the show's later years. Marking a milestone like a 20th anniversary almost requires some degree of looking backward at the show's own history, blurring the line between celebrating past achievements and continuing to tell new, forward-looking stories about the same characters. This kind of anniversary framing makes the broader shift toward meta-humor feel almost built into the show's own structure at this particular point in its run, rather than existing as a separate, unrelated trend happening alongside its regular storytelling. Taken together, this pattern reveals a specific kind of aging challenge, distinct from the ones covered in earlier parts of the show's history. The Turban Cowboy controversy and similar examples involve specific jokes that aged poorly because of shifting social attitudes around particular topics. The meta-humor shift represents something different, a structural change in how episodes were being built, moving gradually away from tightly constructed, character-driven plots, and toward a style increasingly built around commenting on the show's own existence and on current political topics. Where the earlier criticism focused on specific content that had not aged well. This later criticism focuses on the underlying architecture of individual episodes themselves, suggesting a deeper shift in how the show's writers were choosing to approach their material after so many years on the air. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. This particular criticism did not appear overnight, and it built gradually across many seasons before becoming widely discussed as a defining feature of the show's later years.
But even as this pattern developed quietly within the show's own writing style, an entirely separate set of pressures involving the show's commercial future and its ongoing value to its network was unfolding at the exact same time. One that had far less to do with creative choices and far more to do with simple business decisions being made about a program that had, by this point, been running for longer than most television shows ever managed to survive. Section 10. Still the cash cow. Declining buzz, continued renewals, 2018 to 2025. By the time Family Guy reached its later seasons, the show had built up more than 2 decades of history, weathered controversies ranging from government complaints to fan revolts, and absorbed years of criticism from other creators and from television critics about the quality of its writing. Through all of that, one thing never actually changed. The show kept getting renewed, season after season, year after year, regardless of how loudly people argued that its best days were behind it. This pattern becomes especially clear when looking closely at the show's ratings during its most recent seasons, compared to how it performed just a few years earlier. Season 22 averaged around 1.44 million total viewers, along with a 0.45 rating in the key 18 to 49 age demographic used to measure advertising value. Numbers that already represented a real decline compared to the show's own recent history. That same season's performance measured a 15% drop in overall viewership and a 25% drop in the advertising-focused demo rating compared to season 21. This means the show was already losing a meaningful share of its audience well before it reached the seasons most people would consider truly recent. That decline did not level off. Season 22 on its own, once fully measured using live and same-day viewing numbers along with recorded playback, came in at roughly 972,000 viewers and a 0.27 rating in the key demographic. Season 23, the following year, dropped further still, landing at around 723,000 viewers and a 0.19 rating. Comparing these two seasons directly shows a drop of roughly 25% in total viewers within a single year, a significant decline for any show, let alone one that had already been shedding audience for several years running before that point. These numbers matter because television networks generally use exactly this kind of data to decide whether a show deserves to keep running or whether it has become too expensive to justify given how few people are actually watching it live. Under normal circumstances, a show experiencing this kind of steady, multi-year ratings decline would face serious questions about its future. Lower ratings mean lower advertising revenue, and lower advertising revenue eventually runs up against the cost of continuing to produce new episodes, especially for a long-running animated series that requires a large production team, experienced voice actors, and years of accumulated production infrastructure to keep operating. Despite all of this, Family Guy did not slow down. On January 26, 2023, Fox announced that the show had been renewed for both a 22nd and a 23rd season, locking in its continued presence through the 2024 to 2025 broadcast year, regardless of how the ratings during that stretch actually performed. This renewal came at a moment when industry reporting had already begun raising direct questions about whether Family Guy, alongside its longtime Fox companion show The Simpsons, might be approaching the end of its run on the network, given the expensive licensing fees required to keep both aging shows in production. Both shows were, by this point, produced by 20th Television Animation, a studio owned by Disney following its acquisition of large parts of 20th Century Fox's entertainment operations in 2019, adding another layer of corporate complexity to decisions about the show's future that had nothing to do with how funny any individual episode happened to be. This detail about ownership is worth sitting with directly, since it explains a great deal about why the show kept getting renewed even as its live television ratings continued shrinking. Family Guy was no longer simply a Fox show being evaluated purely on how many people tuned in during its original broadcast. It had become part of a much larger media company's broader content library, one that included streaming platforms, syndication deals, and international licensing agreements that generate revenue completely separate from how a single episode performs during its first airing on network television. A show that no longer draws a massive live audience can still hold real financial value to a company like Disney simply by existing as a recognizable, marketable piece of content that continues feeding multiple different revenue streams at once. Evidence of this broader strategy became especially clear starting with season 23. Rather than premiering as a normal fall season
on Fox, the way the show had done every year since its 2005 comeback, Season 23's premiere was delayed, marking the first time since 2005 that a new season did not launch during the traditional fall television schedule. Instead, the season began with 2 holiday specials that aired exclusively on the streaming service Hulu in October and November 2024, months before the rest of the season eventually reached Fox in February 2025. This decision to premiere new Family Guy content on a streaming platform before it ever reached traditional broadcast television represented a clear signal that Disney was actively working the show into its streaming strategy, using new episodes as exclusive content designed specifically to draw subscribers to Hulu, rather than treating a Fox broadcast as the only meaningful launch point for new material. This pattern continued and even expanded with Season 24. That season also began with 2 holiday specials releasing exclusively on Hulu, a Halloween special in October 2025 and a Christmas special in November 2025, before the remaining episodes eventually reached Fox starting in February 2026. Season 24's total episode count also reflected a smaller commitment to traditional broadcast episodes compared to earlier seasons, with only 15 episodes airing on Fox itself, alongside the 2 Hulu exclusive specials, for a total of 17 episodes overall. This represents a noticeably smaller season than the 20 or so episodes the show had regularly produced during many of its earlier years, suggesting a gradual shift toward a leaner, more streaming-focused production model, rather than the traditional full-length broadcast season the show had followed for most of its history. The clearest evidence of just how committed Disney remained to keeping Family Guy running, regardless of its declining live ratings, arrived on April 2nd, 2025. On that date, it was announced that Family Guy had been renewed for 4 additional seasons, described in industry reporting as a mega deal between the show and its parent company. This renewal guarantees the show's continued production all the way through the 2028 to 2029 television season, a stretch of time that lines up directly with the 30th anniversary of the show's original premiere in January 1999. Alongside this extended renewal, each of these upcoming seasons was set to include 15 episodes, a smaller order compared to the 20 or more episodes typical of many earlier seasons, reflecting the same leaner production approach already visible in seasons 23 and 24. This renewal decision stands out sharply when placed next to the ratings numbers covered earlier in this section. A show that had lost roughly a quarter of its audience within a single recent season, and had already lost significant ground in the years before that, was still guaranteed a production run stretching years into the future, all the way to a milestone 30th anniversary. This kind of long-term commitment to a show experiencing this level of ratings decline would be highly unusual for almost any other program without the specific combination of factors working in Family Guy's favor, namely its status as an established, globally recognized brand with decades of existing content already generating revenue through streaming and syndication deals, completely separate from its current, shrinking live broadcast audience. The show's presence across different platforms further illustrates this point directly. According to details tracked around the show's distribution history, Family Guy has maintained an unusually wide footprint across multiple services at once, appearing in syndication on Adult Swim since 2003, later expanding into FXX starting in 2019, and eventually reaching Comedy Central as part of a licensing arrangement announced for 2024, alongside its original home on Fox and its growing presence on Hulu. Family Guy also returned specifically to Adult Swim's weekday programming lineup starting in January 2025, marking a full-circle moment for a show whose entire survival, decades earlier, had originally depended on exactly this same late-night cable block, rescuing it from its very first cancellation back in 2003. This detail carries a specific kind of significance worth pausing on directly. The exact same channel that had once given Family Guy a second life through reruns during its darkest commercial period, helping convince Fox to bring the show back from cancellation in the first place, was still actively airing the show more than 2 decades later, long after the show had become one of the most recognizable and heavily distributed pieces of content in Disney's entire animation library. The relationship between Family Guy and Adult Swim that began purely out of necessity in 2003 had, by 2025, become simply one part of a much larger, deliberately managed distribution strategy, spanning cable reruns, streaming exclusives, and traditional broadcast television, all running simultaneously. The move toward including Comedy Central in the show's rerun rotation, announced as part of a licensing arrangement between Paramount and Disney, adds another layer to this picture. Comedy Central is a channel most closely associated with South Park, the same rival show whose Cartoon Wars episode had spent years mocking Family Guy's writing directly. The fact that reruns of Family Guy eventually found a home airing alongside its longtime creative rival as part of a broader adult animation programming block reflects just how thoroughly business logic had come to override any lingering creative rivalry by this point in both shows' histories. Two shows whose creators had spent nearly 2 decades publicly criticizing each other in interviews ended up sharing space within the same corporate licensing arrangement, treated as compatible pieces of programming within the same adult animation block, rather than true competitors fighting over the same limited audience. Looking at this entire stretch of the show's more recent history reveals a clear and consistent pattern. Family Guy's live television ratings had been declining steadily for years, losing a meaningful share of its audience with each passing season, according to the specific numbers tracked across seasons 21 through 23. At the same time, the show's ownership continued signing increasingly long-term renewal deals, expanding its presence across a growing list of streaming platforms and cable networks, and using new episodes as exclusive content specifically designed to support other parts of its parent company's broader streaming business. These two trends, a shrinking live audience alongside an expanding, increasingly diversified distribution footprint, do not contradict each other the way they might initially appear to. They reflect a specific kind of business strategy, built around a show that no longer needs a massive live audience to remain financially valuable, since its value now comes from multiple different sources operating at the same time, rather than from any single broadcast audience alone. This distinguishes the show's current situation sharply from the commercial pressures it faced during its earliest years on the air. Back in 2002, Fox canceled Family Guy specifically because its live ratings on a single network were not strong enough to justify its continued production, since at that point in television history, live broadcast ratings represented essentially the only meaningful measure of a show's commercial value. By the 2020s, that entire calculation had changed. A show's value could now be measured across dozens of different platforms at once: streaming numbers, syndication deals, international licensing agreements, and merchandise revenue, all factoring into decisions that decades earlier would have depended almost entirely on a single Nielsen ratings number tracking how many households tuned in live on a Sunday night. This shift explains why a show experiencing the kind of steady ratings decline documented across its most recent seasons could still secure a renewal stretching all the way to its 30th anniversary, something that would have been almost impossible to imagine happening to the same show facing the same kind of ratings pressure back during its original struggling run in the early 2000s. The very same commercial forces that once nearly ended the show for good had, over the course of more than 2 decades, transformed into an entirely different system, one where sustained cultural recognition and a large existing content library carried far more weight than any single season's live broadcast performance. Family Guy's story, taken across its full run from its shaky 1999 premiere through its 2 separate cancellations, its unlikely DVD and rerun-driven comeback, its celebrated creative peak, its gradual shift toward broader and more self-referential humor, its repeated clashes with censors, rival creators, and its own fanbase, and now its current position as a steady, long-term piece of a much larger media company's content strategy, reflects something bigger than the story of any single television show. It shows how dramatically the entire business of making and distributing television changed over the exact same 25 years that Peter Griffin spent stumbling through Quahog, and how a show that once nearly died from weak ratings on a single network eventually reached a point where those same kinds of numbers barely factor into whether it continues to exist at all. The Griffins are still out there in Quahog tonight, still arguing, still getting into trouble, still running through the same patterns that carried them from a canceled cartoon in 2002 to a permanent fixture stretching toward its 30th year on the air. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.